Thank you so much. And thank you to the Oley Foundation for inviting me to present this paper on behalf of my colleagues. It's especially exciting for me to present in front of this audience of patients and caregivers because the clinical trial is really for you. And so it's a unique opportunity for me, so thank you all for coming. So let's begin with disclosures. I served as a study investigator for this study and received research support from the sponsors of this study, which were NPS Pharmaceuticals and Shire, and I've also served as a speaker for Thrive. So I don't think I need to talk to this audience and tell them that children with short bowel syndrome often have diminished absorptive capacity, and they may remain parenteral support dependent for many months or even years with little intestinal adaptation under the current standards of care. Teduglutide is a GLP-2 analog, glucagon-like peptide 2. You may know, most of you in the audience, that this drug, teduglutide, was approved in the United States for adults with short bowel syndrome dependent on parenteral support in 2012. You may not know, however, that it was approved for children with short bowel syndrome aged greater than or equal to 1 year in the European Union. And in Europe, it's known as Revestive. Here in the United States, the brand name is Gattex. Teduglutide stimulates small bowel growth. And that's not a growth in the length of the bowel. Rather, it's a growth in the intestinal villi, which are the finger-like projections that extend into the lumen of the bowel and help to absorb nutrients and fluids efficiently. And in this way, this mediates intestinal adaptation in those that receive teduglutide. What I'm talking about today is the initial pediatric clinical study of teduglutide, and it was aimed to evaluate whether teduglutide enhances intestinal adaptation in parenteral support-dependent children with short bowel syndrome who have not had significant advance in their enteral nutrition. This slide is a schematic of the study design. What you can see is that there were 4 different cohorts in this study. 3 of them were treatment cohorts, and the one shown on the bottom here was a standard of care cohort that did not receive teduglutide during the study. The 3 different treatment cohorts received study at 3 different doses. The lowest dose was 0.0125 milligrams per kilogram per day subcutaneously for 12 weeks. The middle dose was 0.025 milligrams per kilogram per day for 12 weeks. And the high dose was 0.05 milligrams per kilogram per day subcutaneously daily for 12 weeks. The observation group did not receive medication, but they did come to study visits in this similar interval as the treatment cohorts, and they received the same nutritional and lab monitoring. All cohorts were screened for at least 2 weeks prior to study entry. They received medications at different doses sequentially for 12 weeks. At week 12, the medication stopped, and data was collected until week 16, at which time the study ended. Safety data were assessed after at least 28 days of teduglutide treatment before the next dosing cohort began. And as you can see, this was not a blinded study, so everyone involved in the study, patient, caregivers, investigators, we all knew which patients were receiving the medication and at what dose. So all patients in this study were aged 1 to 17 years with short bowel syndrome for greater than or equal to 12 months, and they needed to be on parenteral support for at least 30% of their caloric or fluid and electrolyte needs. They could not have had more than a 10% change in parenteral support or an advance in enteral nutrition feeds in the 3 months going into the study. Enteral nutrition calories and volume data in this study were based on commercially available liquid feeds taken orally or given via tube feeds only. So additional solid foods and liquids were considered ad lib nutrition and were not included in any of the calculations of enteral nutrition that you'll see today. The statistical analysis of this study was descriptive statistics. So what this means is you will today hear words like median, minimum, maximum, number of patients, and percentage of patients. These are some of the baseline characteristics of the study. 40 of 42 patients completed the study. One withdrew their consent, and another was withdrawn due to patient protocol noncompliance. And so this is a summary of some of the different characteristics of all different cohorts. And just to point out, you'll see their ages here. Looking at the duration of parental support dependency in years, you can see it was low as 6 months and high of 12 years on parental support. As far as median estimated residual small intestinal length in centimeters, there was a wide range. There was one patient that really just had a remnant of bowel all the way up to 145 centimeters. I'd like to just point out that this 145 centimeter patient happened to be my patient in the study, and I think this highlights the fact that the length of bowel does not necessarily predict parental support need, that it's also the function of the bowel that often is the determinant of how much parental support need is needed in a particular patient. Because by length, you would not predict this patient would need parental support at 30% or more of their calories. The median parental support volume at baseline in liters per week was as low as 4 liters, as high as about 16 liters. Median enteral nutrition volume at baseline in liters per week was as low as 0.3 liters per week and as high as 13.4. So those were some of the characteristics of the patients in this study. So now to get into the nitty-gritty details and some data. This is a graph that shows the decrease in parental support volume, and what it shows is the median weekly parental support volume change from baseline, from 0 to week 12. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I'd like you to focus on week 12. And what you see is that in the standard of care cohort and the low dose cohort, they had no change in parental support volume at week 12 compared to week 1 baseline. But what you do see is that the middle dose group and the high dose group had a 41% and a 25% decrease in parental support volume at week 12 compared to baseline. So these two groups showed that they decreased parental support needs during the 12-week study. What about decrease in parental support calories? Again, you see a similar graph here. Median weekly parental support calorie change from baseline in percentage. And again, a busy slide, but if you could focus here on week 12, what you see is that the standard of care group that did not receive the medication actually increased their parental support calories at week 12 compared to baseline. There was no change in parental support calories in the low dose group, whereas the middle and high dose groups had a decrease in parental support calories of 41% and 44.7% at week 12 compared to baseline. This is one of my favorite slides in this talk. And what it is showing is gain in time off parenteral support at week 12. And the reason I like this slide is that this is the slide that really gets at how this therapeutic really has potential to change the daily lives of patients who receive it. So in the categories looked at here, are the change in hours per day of parenteral support infusion. And what you can see that the standard of care group and the low dose group did not have any change in hours per day, but the 0.025 milligrams per kilogram per day group and the 0.05 treatment group had a decrease in 4 hours per day and 3 hours per day at week 12. How about patients who gained at least 3 days per week off of parenteral support? There were a total of 5 patients that achieved this, 1 from the middle dose group and 4 from the high dose group. And there were actually patients that completely achieved parenteral support independence during the study, 1 from the middle dose group, 3 from the high dose 0.05 milligram per kilogram per dose group. Now, it should be noted that 2 of these 4 patients resumed parenteral support 4 weeks after the teduglutide treatment ended, but 2 remained independent from parenteral support at week 16. What about advances in enteral nutrition volume? That is shown in the graph here. Median weekly enteral nutrition volume change from baseline expressed as a percentage. Again, I want you to focus here at week 12. And what you can see is that there were advances in enteral nutrition volume across all cohorts compared to baseline, and this was generally maintained or increased at week 16 when they were no longer on medication. Here you see advances in the enteral nutrition calories. Median weekly enteral nutrition calorie change from baseline expressed as a percentage. Again, focus on week 12 compared to baseline. There was an increase in enteral nutrition calories across all cohorts, and importantly, this was maintained or increased at week 16 when no longer receiving the medication. This slide shows you the nutritional status at baseline compared to week 12. There was clinical and nutritional status parameters that were maintained despite parenteral support reductions in the teduglutide middle dose and high dose groups. Albumin, blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, and electrolytes such as calcium, magnesium, and phosphate were stable at week 12 compared with baseline. And what you see here is some median weight data, baseline compared to week 12 in all 4 of the cohorts. And you can see that weight was maintained or increased at week 12 despite the decrease in the amount of parenteral support during the study. Let's go on to talk about safety or treatment emergent adverse events. The important thing to remember here is that any clinical study such as this needs to require that the investigators report any adverse events, whether or not they're related to the medication. And so you'll see those listed here. All patients experienced at least 1 treatment emergent adverse event, but most were mild or moderate, and you'll see them listed here. There are things like vomiting, upper respiratory tract infections, catheter complications, fevers, coughs, abdominal pain, headache, etc., diarrhea, central line infections. The most common treatment emergent adverse events in the teduglutide recipients was vomiting. But you can see that these adverse events occurred in both standard of care and the teduglutide recipients. Serious treatment emergent adverse events were experienced by patients in both the teduglutide and standard of care groups, but actually at a lower rate in the teduglutide groups. So 46% rate of treatment emergent adverse events in the teduglutide group compared to 60% in the standard of care group. Importantly, none were considered related to the study treatment. Also importantly, there were no reports of intestinal obstruction, fluid overload, biliary complications such as an inflamed gallbladder or pancreas, or signs and symptoms of colonic polyp formation. And no patients developed neutralizing antibodies to teduglutide, tongue twister. Neutralizing antibodies to teduglutide were not found in the study, but if they were, in theory, these are the type of antibodies that might ameliorate the response to the medication. So here you do see a list of these serious treatment emergent adverse events listed here: central line infection, fevers, catheter-related complications, and upper respiratory infections such as parainfluenza. And what you might notice is that most of the conditions listed here are conditions that are very common to short bowel syndrome patients in general. And so these could occur in patients whether or not they were on a clinical trial, whether or not they were receiving a study medication like teduglutide. So in conclusion, treatment with teduglutide in children whose intestinal rehabilitation had plateaued was associated with a decrease in parenteral support volume and calories and an increase in enteral nutrition volume. This was a study that looked at trends, and it appears that the high dose teduglutide, 0.05 milligrams per kilogram per day, trended to have the most efficacy. This dose reduced parenteral support volume by 25% and calories by 45%. Patients in this cohort advanced enteral nutrition volume by 40% and calories by 62%. In this cohort, parenteral support independence was achieved by 20%, 3 out of 15 patients in this cohort. 27% of patients in this cohort gained at least 3 days per week off parenteral support. At 4 weeks after discontinuing teduglutide, enteral nutrition improvements were maintained and 2 patients remained parenteral support independent. Teduglutide had a generally good safety profile and was well tolerated in this initial pediatric study. Clinical and nutritional status was maintained in teduglutide-treated patients despite reductions in parenteral support, suggesting improved intestinal adaptation. So I'd like to acknowledge the patients that were part of this study, the parents, the caregivers. It takes a whole team to make a clinical study like this work. In addition, all of the study investigators, this was a multi-center trial across 17 studies, mostly in the United States, 1 in the UK. And this was a team that worked immensely well together, and we do it for patients like you. So I'd like to take, if I have a moment, a few questions. If not, I am happy to answer questions at the breakout sessions later today. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you. As the moderator for the session, I kind of have the first chance to ask her a question. And one thing that I noticed was there were fairly large age range in these, and I also noticed that the weight increase was greatest in the lowest dose of teduglutide, if I read it right, which was kind of surprising, but I wonder if the ages were a complicating issue. For instance, you wouldn't expect an 18-year-old to gain the weight that a really young child did. So that was my only explanation I could come up with.
So I would agree that the age makes the weight data a little bit difficult to interpret. And so really, from this study, it's important to remember that we can't do the fancy statistics because there's confounders like the age and the ability to put on weight at a younger age versus an older age. But this was a very solid beginning step for the trial that gave us the trends to kind of go into the next step trial, which is ongoing right now, and would love to talk about more in the breakout sessions, that helped us design the next step trials. So yes, we could really only take trends and not the numbers in this study, and the age range was confounders and limited us in doing the fancy statistics.
And I think the safety aspect of it was really the big point
Right,
here.
that was the big initial step.
Okay, so any other questions, Lynn? Do we have a microphone for her?
Well, I can show. No, let's get it on that. Having participated in the earlier adult studies, I think it was important to recognize that the biggest effect of the drug was on fluid balance and not on improved calorie intake. And it's intriguing that you found that especially after you'd stopped the drug, you still had people holding their own in terms of weight gain. And so I think it raises two questions, really. One is that you are looking at an individual who is maturing. And so the whole question of can you speed up that maturation is an issue with children, or are you just seeing children carry on what you'd expect to do? And therefore, the fact that it was a relatively small group and at different points in there leaves it very difficult to answer that question. Did you improve the rate at which they adapted? And the second question, which I think comes out of this and came out of the adult study too, is that the sustained improvement once you drop the drug, in one sense, makes no sense. This is a medication that causes a change which reverses when you stop. On the other hand, people learn from what they can do in the study, and it would seem as if that was an important component to these children's sustained improvement even off the drug.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
May I just comment on that? I think your points are very well thought out and well taken. The data that I show on sustained weight, we need to remember that that was at week 16, okay? So the total study, treatment was 12 weeks, data out to 16 weeks. And so that's what I show you. I think, and I can speak to this in our small group sessions, I think there's variation when you extend it, these patients out further. I have a bit of experience with that because I had 5 or 6 patients in this initial trial, and I have some insight into what happens on the weeks later. Not everyone continues to have as good electrolyte and fluid balance past week 16 while off the drug. Some do better than others, but I can speak to that today in the sessions. And I think part of that is why the follow-up studies are designed for 6 months of treatment, so longer treatments. I think we're still trying to tease out the length that these children need the drug.
Is there one more question? I think that'll, oh, Lynn, go ahead.
Can I just make one other point? I think it's unfair to not make sure that the audience understands that you're dealing with a drug that stimulates growth. And any drug that stimulates growth could indeed stimulate inappropriate growth. And that becomes much more important in this population. So I don't know whether you were doing careful studies, probably not in such a short study, on the mucosa and so on, but it isn't obvious yet that it's totally safe. Thank you.
Comment?
Yeah, comment to that. That was a concern in the design of the study. If you can imagine, if a medication causes intestinal villi to grow, then if there's any growth in the intestines baseline, you may worry that those polyps, or even if they're malignant type of growth, may grow as well. So as far as that, any patient that was over 12 years of age was scoped prior to entry into the study to clear them from any growth or polyps before entering. And then there were some time points during the study that stool guaiacs were obtained, and if they were positive, that triggered investigation by colonoscopy.